They told you the world is shaped by circumstances. And what if I tell you that everything you see, touch, and feel is born from your imagination? And I will reveal how this hidden power is already within you, waiting to be awakened. I will reveal how belief can rewrite reality itself. And I will reveal the secret that those who master this art move mountains without ever leaving their minds. This is how it begins. With the quiet recognition that imagination is not mere fantasy, but the workshop of creation itself. This is where Neville Goddard steps forward, speaking softly of a technique so simple yet so profound, it shatters the illusion of limitation. This is how he taught that the telephone of the spirit has no wires, no device, only the vibration of thought tuned to a frequency of certainty. This is why he told his students to imagine a conversation, not as a wish, but as a fact already lived and felt. This is the place where the unseen takes form, where a whispered thought becomes a living echo in the corridors of reality. This is where belief ceases to be hope and becomes knowing, a knowing that bends the external world to match the inner state. This is the turning point where you stop asking and start assuming, where you cease to beg life for answers and begin to give it direction. This is how the invisible call begins, your imagination dialing into the realm of possibility and making contact with what was once called impossible. This is where the illusion deepens, because the physical senses will still argue, will still deny, will still mock the unseen act. This is how the faithful persist, hearing the voice of a friend congratulating them, sensing the warmth of success before it knocks on the door. This is how inner hearing becomes outer experience, a replay of your own creative command. This is why Neville said feeling is the secret, because without emotion, the imagined word remains a hollow echo in the void. This is how the emotional tone seals the intention, carrying your vision like sound through an unseen current of power. This is where imagination transcends wishing and becomes creation, because the mind cannot distinguish between what it vividly imagines and what it physically experiences. This is how reality rearranges itself, quietly, invisibly, through what he called the bridge of incidents, leading you effortlessly to what you have already accepted within. This is where the artist of faith begins to trust silence more than effort, the invisible more than evidence. This is how the soul learns to speak without words, how the unseen voice becomes the Creator's signature within you. This is why Neville called it the law, the unbreakable principle that imagination creates reality, that every inner act is a seed awaiting harvest. This is how it ends for now, with a simple reminder whispered through the corridors of your mind. The true telephone is imagination, and the moment you answer it, reality begins to listen. Can you imagine closing your eyes and hearing a voice that feels more real than sound itself? A voice that doesn't come through a device, but through the secret chamber of your mind, where Neville Goddard said all creation begins. This is how it unfolds. When you understand that the telephone technique is not about pretending to call someone, but about entering a state where the call has already happened and the desired outcome is complete. This is where the illusion fades, because in imagination, you are no longer waiting for change, you are living from it. This is how Neville invited his students to sit in stillness, to breathe as if the conversation were unfolding in that very instant. This is the moment when you feel the tone, the laughter, the warmth of someone telling you the thing you long to hear. This is how the technique becomes alive, not as wishful thinking, but as participation in another dimension of reality already finished in spirit. This is where the mind shifts from seeking to receiving, from effort to ease, from lack to fulfillment. This is the turning point where you realize that the only true distance between you and what you want is disbelief itself. This is how the inner conversation begins to replace the outer struggle, whispering quietly, "It is done." This is where you start to notice that imagination has texture, that every voice, every smile, every inflection is as tangible as sound waves in air. This is how the unseen call becomes your bridge of faith, connecting two realities, the one you see and the one you are creating. This is where the conscious mind doubts, but the subconscious listens, taking every inner word as command. This is why Neville said that assuming the wish fulfilled is prayer in action, not asking but affirming what already is. This is how a single imaginal conversation can shift the current of destiny, turning what seems fixed into fluid motion. This is where you learn that imagination obeys you, not circumstance, and that your emotional acceptance is the dial that connects the call. This is how faith becomes the frequency, tuning your inner signal to the vibration of completion. This is where silence speaks louder than words, because the unseen listener already exists within the same creative field. This is how every repetition strengthens the signal, until the imagined voice becomes indistinguishable from truth. This is why reality begins to rearrange itself, bringing messages, calls, and meetings that mirror what you've already lived in mind. This is how you realize that the true miracle of the telephone technique is not hearing another's voice. It is hearing your own power answer back. Picture for a moment a quiet room at night, the hum of the world fading as you close your eyes and enter the theater of imagination where Neville Goddard said all transformation begins. This is how it unfolds. Someone sits in stillness, longing for reconciliation, for love restored, for a voice once lost to return with warmth and forgiveness. This is where Neville's teaching becomes vivid, for he said you need not chase the event. You only need to experience it inwardly, as though it were happening now. This is how the telephone technique takes form, not as fantasy but as inner fact, hearing a loved one say, "It's so good to hear from you again." This is where you stop desiring and start remembering, because imagination works only when you feel the wish already fulfilled. This is how the line between inner and outer dissolves, revealing that consciousness is the true meeting place of souls. This is where emotion becomes electricity, carrying your silent call through the unseen current of creation. This is how the feeling of relief replaces the ache of separation, transforming absence into presence through sheer assumption. This is where you taste the invisible. Every tone, every laugh, every pause, felt with a reality stronger than memory itself. This is how Neville's students came to realize that imagination is not about pretending, but about occupying a new identity where the outcome already lives. This is where time bends, because in the imaginal act the future collapses into the present moment of knowing. This is how energy shifts, magnetizing circumstances and people to match the vibration of your assumed reality. This is where the unseen becomes magnetic law, pulling into alignment the world that mirrors your inner call. This is how the technique proves itself. Soon after, a text, a message, or a knock on the door arrives as though summoned by unseen hands. This is where faith no longer feels abstract because you have touched the invisible and found it tangible. This is how the imagination becomes sacred ground, where prayer is no longer asking, but remembering your creative authority. This is where silence becomes conversation, and emotion becomes evidence of what you have already made real. This is how the simple act of inner hearing bridges the impossible distance between two hearts without a single spoken word. This is where you realize that every call made in spirit echoes in matter. Every unseen conversation writes itself into the script of reality. This is how you finally understand Neville's mystery, that every outer reunion begins first as a whispered moment in the mind. Now consider this. The moment when you realize that hearing within is not madness but mastery, that the silence you once feared is actually the chamber of creation itself. This is how it unfolds. Neville Goddard taught that the inner ear is the antenna of the soul, tuned not to the world of noise but to the frequency of divine imagination. This is where you discover that sound is not limited to air, for the vibration of thought is a tone too subtle for the physical ear, yet powerful enough to reshape destiny. This is how imagination becomes the unseen transmitter, broadcasting intentions into the ether of consciousness where all things are connected. This is where faith becomes the receiver, decoding the silent signal and translating imagination into reality's language. This is how Neville described it, as a sacred exchange between you and the infinite, where every imagined word is a creative decree. This is where you begin to understand that when you hear a congratulatory voice or joyful reply in your mind, you are not hallucinating. You are creating a vibrational prototype of your desire. This is how the invisible conversation becomes the seed of manifestation, planted in the soil of feeling and watered by belief. This is where you learn that your imagination has authority, that the universe listens because it is your own reflection listening back. This is how the technique bridges time and space, allowing you to commune with anyone, anywhere, without physical contact. This is where the illusion of separation dissolves, because consciousness knows no distance and imagination knows no barrier. This is how Neville's students came to see results so uncanny, calls returned, apologies spoken, fortunes reversed, as if reality itself had overheard their inner dialogue. This is where you realize that creation is not a request but a rehearsal, performed until it feels natural enough to become memory. This is how sound without sound moves the fabric of the world, because thought is vibration and feeling is its amplifier. This is where science and mysticism quietly shake hands, for what Neville taught as imagination, physics now hints at through frequency and field. This is how you begin to hear differently, not with ears, but with faith that listens to what has not yet been spoken aloud. This is where stillness becomes symphony, every silence echoing with the potential of what you dare to assume. This is how imagination graduates from tool to truth, from technique to revelation of who you really are, the voice behind all voices. This is where the mystery deepens, because once you have heard the invisible, you can never again believe that silence means nothing. This is how Neville's telephone technique transcends method and becomes initiation, an awakening to the sound of your own creative divinity. Suppose you discover that every conversation you imagine carries weight beyond the mind, that Neville Goddard's telephone technique is not a trick but an enactment of universal law. This is how it unfolds. The act of hearing someone speak in your imagination is not fantasy. It is a command sent through the currents of consciousness that reality cannot ignore. This is where the miracle begins, because once the feeling of fulfillment is real inside you, the outer world bends silently to reflect it. This is how the law operates. Imagination is the cause, circumstances are the effect, and emotion is the fuel that propels the signal into manifestation. This is where you notice subtle shifts, a text, a casual remark, a coincidence, that feel like whispers confirming your inner act. This is how Neville emphasized that you need not manipulate people or situations. You only need to hold the scene as done, and the universe aligns in quiet obedience. This is where doubt threatens, but persistence transforms it into faith. Because law does not question the depth of your feeling, it responds only to the certainty of assumption. This is how the bridge of incidents forms, creating an invisible path from imagination to experience, bending chance into necessity. This is where imagination and reality meet in perfect symmetry, each reflection reinforcing the other until separation disappears. This is how the telephone technique becomes living law. Your inner act is always heard, always registered, always shaping what is to come. This is where students began to see that outer events are never random. They are the logical echo of a focused inner conversation. This is how the subconscious mind acts as executor, taking your imagined dialogue and producing its evidence in the world of form. This is where Neville's instruction becomes practice. Assume the call has been made, the words spoken, the outcome realized, and feel the truth of it with all your senses. This is how intention becomes destiny, and feeling transforms mere thought into action without physical effort. This is where reality begins to obey quietly, creating opportunities, encounters, and communications that mirror your inner certainty. This is how faith becomes visible, because your consistent inner act draws life itself into alignment with your assumption. This is where the law is undeniable, a constant companion that moves in silence but produces results that cannot be ignored. This is how mastery is revealed, not by controlling circumstances, but by assuming them perfectly fulfilled within. This is where Neville's students learned that creation is both immediate and patient, unfolding in perfect timing according to the law. This is how the telephone technique embodies universal truth. The inner call is the blueprint, and reality is the faithful construction crew carrying it into form. Envision a world where thought is not merely chemical reactions in the brain, but a powerful frequency that resonates through every particle of existence. Just as Neville Goddard implied with his telephone technique, this is how it unfolds. When you imagine a conversation as already complete, you collapse all possible outcomes into one inevitable reality, much like quantum particles choosing a state when observed. This is where modern science and ancient metaphysics converge, for the act of assumption mirrors the observer effect. Consciousness influences what becomes manifest. This is how the technique transcends superstition, revealing a framework where imagination is the instrument of causation and feeling is its amplifier. This is where the mind becomes a laboratory, each imaginal act a controlled experiment in creation, producing measurable shifts in life circumstances. This is how energy and attention combine to magnetize events, synchronizing outer reality with inner experience in ways that seem miraculous but are scientifically coherent. This is where Neville's students discovered that the timing of manifestation is irrelevant. Once the assumption is fixed, the universe orchestrates the delivery. This is how the act of hearing, someone in imagination generates a vibrational blueprint which then signals matter to align accordingly. This is where causality is reversed in perception. Effects emerge not from visible effort, but from invisible states of consciousness. This is how repetition in the imagination strengthens the signal, consolidating potentialities into a singular outcome that cannot be denied. This is where quantum uncertainty meets Neville's certainty, showing that what is probable becomes inevitable when fully imagined and felt. This is how students learned that the unseen world obeys precise laws, even if they remain hidden to ordinary perception. This is where imagination acts as a laboratory of reality, each thought an experiment whose outcome is recorded in the fabric of existence. This is how inner conversations are not idle. They are the primary movers of circumstance, setting events into motion before physical evidence appears. This is where the telephone technique illustrates that communication with the universe requires no medium but feeling, no device but attention. This is how invisible waves carry intention, like a signal through an ocean of probabilities, shaping matter according to the clarity and power of your inner act. This is where the mind's focus becomes the architect, building bridges between desire and manifestation with invisible scaffolding. This is how understanding this science transforms fear into curiosity, hesitation into deliberate creation, doubt into unwavering faith. This is where Neville's telephone technique merges metaphysics and mechanics, showing that imagination obeys law as consistently as gravity. This is how the mysterious becomes explainable and the impossible becomes predictable, as your inner call rewrites the script of outer reality. Think of the moment when you notice that life seems to arrange itself around your inner conversation, that reality bends in subtle yet undeniable ways toward the outcome you imagined. This is how it unfolds. Neville Goddard called this the bridge of incidents, a series of synchronistic events that appear to connect your imagination to physical manifestation without obvious effort or intervention. This is where ordinary occurrences suddenly take on extraordinary meaning, each seemingly random encounter acting as a link between your inner act and outer reality. This is how the universe responds to assumption, creating opportunities, meetings, and messages that align perfectly with the reality you have already assumed in mind and feeling. This is where you start to see that nothing happens by chance. The external world is a mirror of your persistent inner state. This is how students learned to trust the sequence of events, knowing that every incident, however small, is a step along the path their imagination has already paved. This is where patience becomes an active practice, because the bridge of incidents requires time for alignment but guarantees fulfillment if the inner act is maintained. This is how Neville emphasized that the outer world need not be forced or manipulated. Your task is to assume, feel, and release, allowing the invisible to choreograph the outcome. This is where subtle signs, a passing remark, a text, a coincidental meeting, confirm that the bridge is real and responsive to the fidelity of your assumption. This is how the telephone technique merges with life, as the imagined conversation begins to echo in the unfolding of tangible events. This is where you realize that reality itself is pliable, a responsive medium that conforms to the consistency of your inner acts of faith. This is how attention and feeling work together to construct this bridge, ensuring that each incident is aligned with the frequency of your imagined outcome. This is where the concept of waiting transforms from anxiety into expectancy, because you know that alignment is already in motion beyond your perception. This is how synchronicity becomes more than coincidence. It becomes evidence that the universe operates according to law, not chance. This is where students observe that the outer world often presents solutions, reconciliations, or confirmations before they consciously ask for them. This is how the invisible conversation catalyzes a series of physical responses, each one silently affirming that the inner act has been accepted and recorded. This is where belief transforms observation, turning what once seemed improbable into an unfolding certainty. This is how the bridge of incidents teaches that imagination is causative and outer events are merely effects of inner realities. This is where mastery is shown in trust, as students learn to let the inner act speak first, knowing that the external world will follow. This is how Neville's telephone technique demonstrates that creation is not about force, but about alignment, patience, and unwavering assumption. Ask yourself what happens when you let doubt slip away and embrace a certainty so deep that imagination and reality feel indistinguishable, as Neville Goddard insisted they must. This is how it unfolds. Faith is not wishful thinking. It is the unshakable conviction that the imagined conversation has already taken place, that the desired outcome is now a lived experience within your consciousness. This is where the telephone technique becomes alive, because without faith, the inner voice is empty, a sound without substance or power. This is how students learn to suspend questioning, to let the feeling of reality carry them through every silent moment of expectation. This is where persistence in assumption matters more than visible proof, because the law responds to inner certainty, not to outer evidence. This is how Neville emphasized that faith is the currency of manifestation, and imagination is the treasury where it is spent. This is where you realize that checking for results too soon only disrupts the vibrational signal, weakening the potency of your inner call. This is how inner listening becomes a practice of trust, knowing that the universe mirrors the conviction you cultivate within. This is where patience and persistence intertwine, allowing faith to become a living, breathing force within your psyche. This is how the telephone technique demonstrates that belief is not passive, but an active, creative energy shaping circumstances invisibly yet irrevocably. This is where every imagined word, every inner tone, is amplified by the strength of your feeling, ensuring that reality responds in kind. This is how faith acts as both shield and bridge, protecting the imagined act from doubt while linking it to the outer world. This is where Neville's students discovered that emotional fidelity, the sustained feeling of reality, is the key to tangible results. This is how assumption becomes ritual, repeated until the subconscious recognizes it as truth, thereby mobilizing circumstances effortlessly. This is where the power of imagination is confirmed. Outer events begin to reflect inner certainty with uncanny accuracy. This is how the unseen becomes undeniable, and what was once invisible takes shape in the material world. This is where faith transforms waiting into a sacred interval, a time in which alignment is perfected and preparation is completed. This is how the telephone technique transcends simple method, evolving into a lifestyle of inner knowing and outer manifestation. This is where conviction replaces hope, and imagination is no longer a tool, but a reality-shaping authority. This is how Neville's teaching on faith shows that creation is not about striving, but about embodying the reality you wish to see, allowing the universe to orchestrate the details flawlessly. Envision a world where every imagined moment is crafted with precision, where Neville Goddard's students learned that the smallest detail can carry the full weight of creation into reality. This is how it unfolds, choosing a short, perfect scene to represent the desired outcome, not a long story, ensures that the subconscious accepts it as real and complete. This is where imagination is sculpted with care, each word, tone, and gesture charged with the feeling of fulfillment. This is how the telephone technique gains clarity, for brevity and vividness sharpen the signal between thought and manifestation. This is where students discovered that the perfect scene is always one that could only happen if the wish were already fulfilled, leaving no ambiguity for doubt to creep in. This is how emotion saturates the scene, giving it life and authenticity beyond mere visualization. This is where the mind's focus consolidates, turning multiple desires into one powerful, directed act of creation. This is how repetition strengthens the image, embedding it into the subconscious as undeniable reality. This is where the scene is rehearsed in silence, feeling it fully, as though it were happening in real time. This is how the law of assumption works, because the subconscious cannot distinguish between vivid imagination and lived experience. This is where the telephone technique shows its precision. Each imagined word, pause, and inflection carries creative weight. This is how students learn to refine the scene until it vibrated with the same reality as memory itself. This is where simplicity triumphs over complexity, as a single perfect moment contains all that is necessary to command outer events. This is how imagination becomes intentional, focused, and irresistible to the forces of reality. This is where the perfect scene acts as a seed, germinating in the subconscious until outer circumstances align in harmony. This is how the bridge of incidents responds, each small event confirming that the imagined reality is already underway. This is where emotional fidelity maintains the scene's potency, ensuring that no outer distraction can dilute its effect. This is how the student becomes both actor and audience, fully immersed in a reality that is already theirs by assumption. This is where the art of scene crafting transforms from exercise into mastery, turning imagination into the blueprint for life. This is how Neville's telephone technique reveals that precision, feeling, and clarity in imagination are not optional. They are essential for manifestation to unfold flawlessly. Now consider this. The subtle vibrations of feeling, the feeling that Neville Goddard said, carry the full creative charge of your imagined conversation, transforming mere thought into magnetic reality. This is how it unfolds. Every word in your inner call must be saturated with emotion, for feeling is the amplifier that makes imagination irresistible to the subconscious and the unseen world. This is where tone matters more than content, because a voice filled with joy, relief, or love resonates far deeper than any factual statement. This is how the telephone technique harnesses emotion, turning your inner dialogue into a living, vibrating command that shapes outer circumstances. This is where students discovered that a simple scene, perfectly imagined, gains power only when infused with the precise emotional state corresponding to fulfillment. This is how feeling acts as a bridge, connecting the imagined scene with the unseen forces that orchestrate reality's response. This is where vibration becomes the language of creation, translating the inner state into events, encounters, and messages aligned with your desire. This is how Neville emphasized that emotion without imagination is weak, but imagination without feeling is inert. Both are required for the law to operate. This is where the inner ear perceives not just words, but the underlying certainty and excitement, which sets manifestation into motion. This is how students learn to rehearse not only dialogue, but the sensation of hearing and being heard, internalizing the reality of completion. This is where subtle inflections, the warmth of a laugh, the tenderness in a tone, carry invisible power far beyond the conscious mind's calculation. This is how the technique transforms imagination into lived experience, because the subconscious cannot ignore a feeling that is vivid, precise, and authentic. This is where the outer world begins to reflect the emotional reality within, offering signs, synchronicities, and responses that echo the inner call. This is how repeated emotional immersion strengthens the signal, embedding the imagined outcome deeply within your being. This is where the law of assumption operates silently yet relentlessly, bending events toward the fulfillment of the charged scene. This is how students discovered that outer results are almost immediate once the emotional tone is unwavering and sustained. This is where doubt is neutralized, because the power of feeling drowns out hesitation and uncertainty. This is how the telephone technique teaches that reality obeys not logic, but emotion, and the world mirrors the depth of inner conviction. This is where the mastery of tone becomes mastery of creation, because the vibration you maintain in imagination becomes the architecture of your life. This is how Neville's method reveals that feeling is the secret ingredient, the invisible current that animates the telephone call from mind into matter. Can you imagine perceiving a voice more vividly than any sound in the physical world? a voice that exists solely within, yet carries the authority to shape reality itself, as Neville Goddard described. This is how it unfolds. The telephone technique relies on inner hearing, the ability to listen with the imagination as if the other person's words were tangible, resonating in your mind and body. This is where imagination transcends vision, proving that hearing is as potent a sense as sight when it comes to creation. This is how the act of hearing someone in your mind becomes a command, each word a seed that the subconscious faithfully cultivates into outer manifestation. This is where students realize that tone, cadence, and timing are all crucial, for the mind responds to the texture of imagined speech as if it were real conversation. This is how subtle nuances, a pause, a sigh, a laugh, carry the weight of reality, shaping the emotional resonance of the scene. This is where inner hearing connects directly to feeling, for what you hear internally must evoke the sensation of truth, certainty, and fulfillment. This is how the telephone technique demonstrates that imagination is not passive. It is a dynamic instrument of causation, translating sound into circumstance. This is where Neville's teaching becomes tangible. Hearing internally is not fantasy, but a rehearsal of reality that the universe cannot ignore. This is how students practice this skill, immersing themselves in the imagined dialogue until it felt more alive than memory. This is where the unseen becomes your stage, and every inner word becomes a director guiding the outcome of events in the material world. This is how the mind's attention to subtle auditory detail accelerates manifestation, aligning your internal frequency with the desired reality. This is where the law of assumption shows its power. Outer events follow the vibrational blueprint laid down by inner hearing and feeling. This is how mastery emerges. Because once you can hear a conversation internally, the world has no choice but to reflect its completion externally. This is where the illusion of waiting dissolves, replaced by the certainty that the imagined words have already set reality in motion. This is how inner hearing becomes a superpower, translating thought into tangible experience with precision and inevitability. This is where students discovered that the consistency of internal listening determines the speed and accuracy of manifestation. This is how the telephone technique proves that imagination is not secondary to reality, but primary, creating the patterns that outer life mirrors. This is where inner hearing becomes a sacred dialogue, a communication with the universe that carries authority and expectation. This is how Neville's insight reveals that the voice you imagine is not just sound, it is the instrument through which creation itself responds. Picture for a moment the countless accounts of Neville Goddard's students, people who, after practicing the telephone technique, watched impossibilities transform into everyday reality, their lives quietly rearranged by imagination alone. This is how it unfolds. Stories emerge of reconciliations, job offers, financial windfalls, and healing communications that arrive as if summoned by the inner call. This is where skepticism often falters, because the evidence is lived, tangible, and undeniable to those who dared to assume the scene as real. This is how students shared their experiences, revealing that the key to success was not elaborate visualization, but faithful feeling and consistent assumption of the outcome. This is where the potency of inner hearing is confirmed, as imagined voices, tones, and conversations materialize in the outer world with uncanny accuracy. This is how the bridge of incidents manifests, turning imagination into a chain of synchronicities that guide reality toward fulfillment. This is where ordinary people realize that Neville's teachings are not theoretical exercises, but practical, repeatable tools for creation. This is how the emotional tone, once properly established in the inner scene, becomes a magnet for outer confirmations and opportunities. This is where stories of rapid manifestation inspire new students to persist, knowing that the unseen is actively responding to their inner act. This is how Neville's telephone technique validates itself repeatedly, through countless anecdotes of desired outcomes arriving as though by magic, yet entirely law-abiding in the metaphysical sense. This is where students notice patterns, specific feelings, clarity of dialogue, and unwavering assumption consistently produce results faster and with more certainty. This is how patience and persistence, combined with precision of feeling, become the formula for repeated success. This is where inner conviction grows, because each story reinforces the truth that imagination is not fantasy, but the primary reality from which the world is shaped. This is how the technique transcends method, becoming a philosophy and lifestyle of conscious creation, taught through lived experience. This is where doubt and hesitation are gradually replaced by confidence in the invisible forces operating on behalf of faithful imagination. This is how students discovered that sharing testimony itself strengthens belief, amplifying the unseen signals that bring manifestation into form. This is where repetition and consistency become sacred acts, ensuring that every imagined conversation carries maximum creative weight. This is how the telephone technique transforms from a tool into proof of universal law, showing that reality always obeys imagination first and circumstance second. This is where the cumulative power of testimony demonstrates that manifestation is not rare or exceptional, but a natural outcome of understanding and applying the principles Neville outlined. This is how the students' lived experiences illuminate the path, guiding new practitioners to assume, feel, and receive without resistance or doubt. Can you imagine the quiet intensity of nightly practice when the same imagined conversation is repeated with unwavering feeling until it settles into the subconscious as an unshakable truth, just as Neville Goddard taught? This is how it unfolds. Repetition is not redundancy, but reinforcement, each rehearsal embedding the scene deeper into the mind, aligning thought, feeling, and expectation into a single, coherent force. This is where students discovered that a scene felt and repeated with conviction becomes a blueprint for reality, silently directing the bridge of incidents to materialize in the outer world. This is how the telephone technique gains momentum, because each repetition strengthens the vibrational signal, ensuring that the unseen universe receives it clearly and responds accordingly. This is where doubt is neutralized, for the act of returning to the scene nightly affirms its truth beyond intellectual debate. This is how Neville emphasized that repeated assumption is the mechanism through which imagination becomes fact, not fiction, in the outer realm. This is where consistency transforms imagination from an occasional experiment into a reliable tool of creation. This is how the mind begins to expect fulfillment automatically, as repetition programs the subconscious to accept the reality of the imagined call as already accomplished. This is where emotional fidelity is reinforced, as repeated feeling saturates the scene with authenticity, making manifestation inevitable. This is how each inner rehearsal becomes a wave, pushing circumstances, people, and events into alignment with the frequency of your desire. This is where the art of repetition shows its subtlety, for it must be performed with the same precision and intensity each time, without hurry or distraction. This is how Neville's students experienced acceleration of manifestation, noticing that outer results often followed the rhythm of inner practice. This is where patience is cultivated, because repetition teaches the mind to persist without immediate evidence, trusting the law to respond in its perfect timing. This is how the inner call gains permanence, ensuring that the imagined conversation is encoded into the subconscious as a living memory rather than a fleeting thought. This is where the bridge of incidents solidifies, linking repeated internal acts to tangible outcomes in a seamless chain of synchronicity. This is how repetition strengthens belief, because the consistency of inner experience confirms the reliability of imagination as the cause of reality. This is where mastery begins, as repeated, focused practice trains both mind and emotion to hold the scene without wavering. This is how the telephone technique becomes habitual, a natural rhythm in the student's life, blending imagination and feeling into effortless creation. This is where the unseen begins to obey predictably, demonstrating the power of persistent assumption. This is how Neville's principle of repetition ensures that imagination is not fleeting fantasy, but a dependable instrument for shaping the world. Ask yourself what happens when uncertainty creeps in, when the mind begins to question the reality of your imagined conversation. And Neville Goddard warns that this is the moment most likely to undermine creation if not handled correctly. This is how it unfolds. Doubt is not an enemy but a signal, a test of your persistence in assumption and your commitment to the inner call. This is where students learn to recognize the subtle whispers of disbelief, and return immediately to the feeling of the fulfilled scene, refusing to entertain contrary thoughts. This is how the telephone technique maintains power, because each act of inner hearing must be reinforced by unshakable faith, even in the presence of apparent contradiction. This is where Neville emphasized that outer evidence is irrelevant. What matters is the unwavering conviction within, the living assumption that the call has already been made and received. This is how students discovered that resisting doubt strengthens imagination, solidifying the inner reality as the source from which outer events inevitably flow. This is where the mind begins to internalize the law, understanding that manifestation follows feeling and assumption, not external proof or timing. This is how subtle hesitation can be transformed into renewed focus, turning moments of insecurity into opportunities for deeper alignment with desire. This is where repetition and consistency act as antidotes to skepticism, embedding the imagined conversation into subconscious certainty. This is how the outer world begins to reflect inner mastery, even if initially nothing appears to have changed. This is where students realize that doubt is temporary and obedience to assumption is permanent, and the bridge of incidents continues silently, building the path toward fulfillment. This is how Neville's teaching empowers the practitioner, showing that the inner act is sovereign, and outer events must comply with sustained assumption. This is where the telephone technique demonstrates resilience, functioning as a tool of creation even when outer circumstances provoke disbelief. This is how the practitioner learns to let go of outcomes while holding the feeling, trusting the unseen to complete what has already been assumed. This is where emotional fidelity becomes the anchor, preventing doubt from fragmenting the imaginal act and weakening its vibrational command. This is how students cultivate patience and quiet confidence, knowing that persistence in inner hearing always produces alignment. This is where the law operates impartially, responding not to fear, but to the clarity and consistency of inner focus. This is how the practitioner transforms resistance into fuel, using doubt as a mirror to reinforce the certainty of imagination. This is where the telephone technique matures, teaching that mastery is not the absence of doubt, but the unwavering return to assumption despite it. This is how Neville's guidance ensures that the inner call remains powerful, precise, and unstoppable, shaping reality from the silent depths of consciousness. Envision a moment of stillness after the imagined conversation, when the words have been spoken in your mind, the tone perfectly felt, and you release the scene into the unseen, trusting it to manifest as Neville Goddard taught. This is how it unfolds. Once the inner call is complete, silence becomes sacred, for it is in this quiet interval that the law begins to move without interference from doubt or anxiety. This is where patience is not passive, but active, a conscious surrender to the process, knowing that the bridge of incidents has been set in motion and events will unfold in perfect timing. This is how students learn that attempting to force results or constantly check for proof disrupts the subtle flow of creation, weakening the signals sent from imagination to reality. This is where faith is exercised most profoundly, in the trustful waiting that follows the completion of the scene, allowing the universe to orchestrate outcomes beyond your conscious control. This is how the telephone technique demonstrates that inner work precedes outer manifestation, and that the unseen response is often more precise and aligned than any human effort. This is where stillness becomes a companion, and silence carries the weight of your assumption, reinforcing the imagined conversation without interference. This is how emotional fidelity continues even after the act is done, sustaining the scene's vibrational imprint in the subconscious and ensuring the law is obeyed. This is where the student discovers that absence of evidence is not absence of power, and that the unseen machinery of manifestation operates quietly yet relentlessly. This is how Neville emphasized that release is essential, for clinging to outcome introduces resistance, while letting go allows alignment and synchronicity to emerge naturally. This is where outer events begin to signal the internal act, often subtly, through unexpected encounters, messages, or circumstances that confirm the unseen call has been heard. This is how repeated practice of release cultivates trust, patience, and confidence in the reliability of imagination, as the creative source of reality. This is where the telephone technique shows its elegance. Creation is complete at the moment of inner hearing, and the world simply follows silently. This is how students learn to honor this interval, embracing it as the sacred time when the invisible bridges the visible, without interference or doubt. This is where the mind and heart are trained to maintain stillness and certainty, reinforcing the inner signal and allowing manifestation to flow effortlessly. This is how the technique teaches that timing is never immediate nor accidental. It unfolds according to the perfect orchestration of law. This is where imagination's authority is confirmed, because every released scene eventually manifests exactly as assumed. This is how silence transforms from emptiness into power, becoming the fertile ground where desires grow unseen yet inevitable. This is where mastery deepens, as the practitioner learns to balance action with stillness, assumption with patience, and imagination with trust. This is how Neville's telephone technique reveals that creation is complete the moment you hear it in the mind, and the outer world is only a faithful echo of the inner act. Suppose you discover that every imagined conversation is not just an act of personal creation, but a signal sent through a vast, unseen network that orchestrates reality in response. As Neville Goddard described, this is how it unfolds. The inner call acts as a conductor, directing the currents of unseen forces to arrange events, people, and circumstances in perfect harmony with the assumed scene. This is where students realize that imagination is not passive, but the active agent shaping the flow of life, and feeling is the energy that fuels the conductor's command. This is how the telephone technique transforms from a method into a symphony, with each thought, tone, and emotion playing a precise part in the composition of outcomes. This is where alignment occurs invisibly, as the law responds to the internal orchestration with a fidelity beyond comprehension. This is how persistence and clarity ensure that the signal is transmitted without distortion, avoiding interference from doubt, fear, or distraction. This is where subtle synchronistic events, the bridge of incidents, emerge like notes in a musical score, linking imagination to manifestation seamlessly and effortlessly. This is how the practitioner learns to trust the unseen conductor, knowing that outer evidence will follow when timing is perfect. This is where imagination becomes an instrument of precision, and inner hearing ensures that every nuance of the desired conversation is transmitted intact. This is how students discovered that mastery lies not in manipulating circumstances, but in perfecting the internal act, tuning every detail until the frequency of reality responds. This is where the emotional tone is the conductor's baton, guiding the orchestra of unseen forces with exacting authority and grace. This is how repeated practice strengthens the signal, as the subconscious mind internalizes the conversation as an accomplished reality. This is where outer confirmation eventually appears, perfectly timed, often in ways that surpass expectation or understanding. This is how the telephone technique teaches that creation obeys law, not force, and that unseen currents respond faithfully to deliberate imagination. This is where students realize that every imagined conversation carries authority, as if it were a command issued to the machinery of reality itself. This is how inner hearing, feeling, and assumption work together as a trio, conducting the flow of events toward fulfillment with seamless elegance. This is where the power of imagination is undeniable, for the external world becomes a reflection of the precise inner act. This is how the practitioner learns to move silently, knowing that visible action is secondary to the orchestration of unseen forces. This is where the invisible conductor demonstrates that creation is not random, but responsive, deliberate, and entirely faithful to the assumptions held within. This is how Neville's telephone technique ultimately shows that the mind is both composer and conductor, and imagination is the music that reality must echo. Think of the moment when continued dedication transforms imagination from casual play into unstoppable creative force, as Neville Goddard emphasized that persistence is the lifeblood of manifestation. This is how it unfolds. Students discovered that repeated, consistent inner conversations, held with full feeling and assumption, gradually engrave themselves into the subconscious, making outer evidence inevitable. This is where patience and persistence intertwine, for the law of assumption does not yield to hesitation, only to sustained conviction and emotional fidelity. This is how the telephone technique becomes resilient, because the more faithfully you repeat the inner act, the stronger the vibrational signal sent to the universe. This is where temporary setbacks or delays no longer deter, because persistent assumption maintains the reality of the scene internally, independent of outward appearances. This is how Neville taught that the unseen mind is not persuaded by arguments or explanations, but by repeated acts of confident imagination. This is where persistence converts belief into knowing, as the subconscious begins to treat imagined conversations as lived events. This is how repeated practice refines precision, reinforcing the tonal, emotional, and imaginal details until they are seamless and unbreakable. This is where students observe that outer manifestations accelerate as repetition strengthens the inner signal, producing synchronicities that confirm unseen alignment. This is how the law of assumption rewards fidelity. For each faithful rehearsal brings the scene closer to tangible expression in the material world. This is where inner hearing and feeling, practiced persistently, become second nature, allowing imagination to command without effort. This is how patience and consistency cultivate confidence, transforming doubt into trust in the law of creation itself. This is where the bridge of incidents becomes more robust, each event aligning more precisely as the inner act is maintained without wavering. This is how the technique teaches that mastery is earned not through fleeting inspiration, but through steadfast, repeated assumption until inner reality is unshakable. This is where the student learns to let go of timing and outer control, focusing solely on sustaining the felt reality of the scene. This is how persistence produces resilience, ensuring that temporary challenges do not dilute the power of imagination. This is where repeated inner acts create momentum, an invisible current that draws outer circumstances with almost irresistible force. This is how Neville's students learned that true creation is a product of unwavering internal dedication, not hurried action or external manipulation. This is where the telephone technique shows that the combination of repetition, emotional fidelity, and assumption forms a triad of power that reality must obey. This is how persistence guarantees that imagination ceases to be mere thought and becomes a living, manifesting force in the world. Picture for a moment the subtle shift that occurs when you infuse your imagined conversation with gratitude, feeling deeply as though the call has already been answered and the outcome perfectly fulfilled, just as Neville Goddard taught. This is how it unfolds. Gratitude amplifies the vibrational signal, saturating the imagined scene with a sense of completion that the subconscious cannot resist. This is where students discovered that the emotional quality of thankfulness transforms imagination from an exercise into a living reality, strengthening the bridge of incidents that carries the inner act into outer manifestation. This is how the telephone technique becomes charged, because gratitude adds a magnetic resonance that draws circumstances, people, and events into alignment effortlessly. This is where subtle feelings, joy, relief, appreciation, enhance the power of inner hearing, making the imagined voice feel irrefutably real. This is how Neville emphasized that feeling gratitude for what is already assumed creates an atmosphere in which the law operates with maximum responsiveness. This is where the mind and heart merge, for gratitude solidifies certainty and removes resistance, allowing the imagined outcome to take root fully within consciousness. This is how students observed that outer confirmations often arrive more swiftly when the inner act is accompanied by authentic appreciation, even before evidence appears. This is where the vibrational field of gratitude acts as a magnet, aligning unseen forces to produce results that reflect the inner state of fulfillment. This is how imagination, feeling, and gratitude combine into a triad of power, ensuring that the telephone call in mind ripples into the physical world with clarity and precision. This is where subtle signs, a call, message, or encounter, appear as acknowledgments of the inner reality, confirming the scene's successful transmission into form. This is how persistent gratitude reinforces faith, making it easier to return to the scene with certainty if doubt arises. This is where the technique demonstrates elegance, because outer manifestations no longer require struggle. They are drawn naturally to the vibrational signature created by thankfulness. This is how students learn to dwell in the feeling of fulfilled desire, letting gratitude permeate every imagined word, tone, and inflection. This is where the inner call becomes richer, more alive, and more irresistible to the law of creation. This is how the bridge of incidents flows effortlessly, guided by the invisible current generated by appreciation and feeling. This is where outer reality mirrors the inner scene with uncanny fidelity, each event echoing the emotional tone established in imagination. This is how gratitude transforms waiting into celebration, anticipation into lived experience, and imagination into tangible reality. This is where Neville's telephone technique reveals its full potency. The combination of assumption, feeling, and thankfulness ensures that the unseen responds faithfully, turning imagination into unstoppable creative power. Think of the moment when the imagined conversation manifests outwardly, a call, a message, or a reconciliation, and you recognize with awe that the inner act alone orchestrated this reality, just as Neville Goddard promised. This is how it unfolds. The external event serves as confirmation, a tangible echo of the unseen conversation that was completed in imagination long before it appeared in the world of form. This is where students often experience a profound shift, realizing that creation begins not with circumstances, but with the fidelity of feeling and assumption. This is how the telephone technique validates itself. What was once imagined now exists, and the line between inner and outer reality dissolves completely. This is where the bridge of incidents becomes visible, a chain of seemingly coincidental events that perfectly mirrors the inner act. This is how the practitioner understands the depth of Neville's teaching, that imagination is not a tool but the source, and all else is effect. This is where gratitude, persistence, and emotional fidelity converge, producing a moment of undeniable proof that the law of assumption operates without fail. This is how students often describe a sense of wonder and empowerment, recognizing their ability to shape reality with precision through inner acts alone. This is where the subtle nuances rehearsed, the tone, timing, and feeling of the call, reveal their power in manifesting exact outcomes. This is how outer events become mirrors of inner reality, confirming the effectiveness of consistent practice and sustained assumption. This is where trust in the unseen is cemented, for once one experiences such a manifestation, doubt loses its grip and faith deepens naturally. This is how students learn that creation is continuous. Every imagined call, conversation, or scenario sends new ripples through reality, expanding the realm of possibility. This is where the telephone technique transforms from exercise to lifestyle, as one recognizes that every interaction can be pre-experienced and fulfilled in mind before appearing externally. This is how persistence and repetition are rewarded, with tangible evidence that imagination and feeling are the ultimate instruments of creation. This is where the student experiences liberation, understanding that outer events are malleable reflections of inner certainty. This is how the mastery of inner hearing, emotional tone, and assumption culminates in the undeniable experience of co-creating with universal law. This is where the invisible bridge solidifies, connecting imagination to manifestation with perfect fidelity and timing. This is how each successful inner call reinforces confidence, establishing a pattern of deliberate creation for future desires. This is where Neville's telephone technique proves itself as more than a method. It is a portal to understanding the infinite power already within, ready to shape life at will. This is how the practitioner finally realizes that the world itself is an echo of the imagination faithfully held and persistently assumed. Ask yourself what it feels like to step fully into the understanding that every imagined conversation, every assumed scene, every feeling held with conviction is a direct act of creation, as Neville Goddard revealed. This is how it unfolds. Mastery emerges when imagination, feeling, faith, and persistence converge into a seamless practice, transforming the mind into a conscious architect of reality itself. This is where students realize that the telephone technique is not simply a method for manifesting calls or reconciliations, but a blueprint for commanding life through the inner world. This is how the practitioner understands that the unseen obeys consistency, clarity, and emotional fidelity, aligning circumstances to reflect the inner act with absolute precision. This is where imagination becomes sovereign, and the outer world serves only as a reflection of the reality firmly established within. This is how mastery deepens, as repeated practice ingrains the laws of assumption, making creation effortless and intuitive. This is where the bridge of incidents flows predictably, each outer event confirming the inner act, reinforcing trust, and empowering further creation. This is how students experience freedom, knowing that outer circumstances cannot override the certainty held in mind and heart. This is where the inner ear, inner conversation, and emotional tone combine to produce tangible outcomes without struggle, proving that imagination is the ultimate creative force. This is how persistence and repetition solidify authority over unseen forces, ensuring that imagination is not fleeting, but enduring and potent. This is where gratitude and faith act as accelerators, infusing every inner act with irresistible energy that draws circumstances toward manifestation. This is how mastery is measured, not by occasional success, but by the ability to consistently shape reality according to deliberate inner acts. This is where the practitioner begins to create proactively rather than reactively, understanding that life is a canvas for imagination to paint with fidelity and precision. This is how students recognize that every desire, once imagined and felt as fulfilled, is already a living blueprint, waiting only for outer alignment to appear. This is where doubt, fear, and hesitation lose influence, replaced by unwavering assumption and the certainty of inner knowing. This is how Neville's telephone technique transcends method, becoming a philosophy of life. Creation begins and ends within the mind and heart, and the world outside is simply the faithful echo of inner reality. This is where imagination is experienced as power, feeling as authority, and assumption as law, culminating in a state of conscious co-creation with the universe. This is how students finally internalize the principle that they are the architects of their reality, with imagination as both foundation and blueprint. This is where mastery is not the accumulation of external results, but the effortless alignment of inner reality with universal law, producing manifestations naturally and reliably. This is how Neville Goddard's teaching culminates. The inner act is sovereign, imagination is supreme, and the telephone technique is the gateway to mastering the art of deliberate creation itself.